Hi to you all. Hi Jodie, it's nice to be here in conversation with you on the occasion of your exhibition, Guard. And I think you mentioned about earth casting and the studio, and it's been really great getting to know your work over these months, and I think that could be quite an interesting place maybe to start our conversation today, which is the studio itself, where these works were made. I was lucky enough to see a lot of them being made when I came last year, and earlier this year, sorry. So yeah, perhaps we could sort of start with that and to have an introduction to describing your practice in your studio and what we might find when we come there.
My studio is at APT in Deptford. It's a very tranquil space that sits on the river, so I get to see the tide rise and fall. It has an outside yard which I rely on a lot to make my work. I don't think I could have made much recent work without having outside space. The yard is where I store and work the earth that I need to earth cast. However, the works themselves were made indoors because I needed level ground. Because of the numbers involved, I needed to be really organised with space. So although the moulds were floor-based, I built a lot of racking systems so that newly excavated works could be wall-mounted on racks, and then the clean works, the finished works, went into a room full of racks. The earth itself has a very high clay content, so I learnt over the 9 months that I was casting the project, I learnt through experience how long I sort of refined my process. So I found that how long I needed to keep the works in the mould to get them out safely, and how long the works needed to dry before I cleaned them. I refined the process, but I've had the studio for, and that's why you saw works in so many different stages of production when you came to visit. But I've had the studio for 10 years now, and I think it will be the last show that I make there because I'm currently in the process of moving to East Sussex. So after 25 years in London, I'm going back to the area where I was born.
Yeah. And this process of earth casting, how did you first discover it?
Up until 2009, my work was very different. The work that I made at art school and directly after was highly decorative and ornate and very craft-led. But after my first museum show at Towner in Eastbourne, I really felt I had reached a full stop in a way of working, and I really wanted to go back to basics. And over the years, many materials have become part of my sculptural vocabulary, so the blood and the bone and the plaster. And I wanted to focus more intently on the materials themselves and try and let them speak more poetically and elegantly without interruption. So lots of the materials that I worked with, I ground down to make dusts and pigments, which I used to stain the floors and mark the walls. And as that line of inquiry continued, I thought about not only using really basic materials, but also basic processes like weaving and carving. These are the earliest forms of making art. And earth casting, for me, was the simplest way to make an object, literally to dig a hole in the ground and pour in plaster. And that's really what the first earth casts were. But as the work developed over time, I found I could press objects into the earth and to make a rudimentary mould. And Guard upstairs is my most delicate earth cast to date.
Yeah, and something that we really noticed when we're walking through the exhibition is how each of the objects have their own unique patina. You know, they're created from different kinds of flowers and plant life that you've brought together on these steel structures, sentinel-like objects that we encounter in the gallery. So yeah, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about the process of making this work in terms of the material and also the importance of, you know, your artist hand, you know, in everything that you do.
So the sculptures were cast from plant material that has been bound with cloth and thread. And this binding is very important because it shows the artist's hands. It shows that the plants have been selected, edited and manipulated to form very delicate, slender sculptures. Binding is deeply rooted in ritual and tradition and ceremony, and throughout time humans have bound body parts or books and plants. Once the plant sculpture is removed, I bent a steel rod, the exact same profile of the imprint left behind, and it was suspended over the mould using wires, and then the Jesvanite was poured into the imprint and encasing the steel rod, so that each work has this kind of steel backbone. I had to leave them for about a day, and then the next day they could be excavated. And then, depending on the temperature in the studio, I would wait a week before I could clean them with a hose and a toothbrush. And that was really the first time I ever saw the actual work that had been cast. And the wires that I used to suspend the armature then get used to tie the sculpture onto its stand at exhibition. The making is really important to me, and I think in a world where technology, where we live our lives more and more virtually, I think the artist's hand and the making and the process remain really important.
And of course with earth casting there is this direct encounter with the earth. There's a material imprint that's left, there's always a level of unpredictability in terms of what you're going to get, and I'm curious about how important that is for you, the unpredictability, chance, all of the different accidents that come into a process such as that.
So my work develops through making, through going into the studio and working directly with the materials. I have like a starting idea, and then there's just a lot of making, and so there's always a lot of false starts, accidents, mistakes along the way, but they help change, they help develop the work, they shift the direction or the focus or even change the process, and I always think that the work is much better for it. I think you end up making something that you could never have predicted that you could make on paper. Making art is a privilege, but it's also challenging and difficult. And I think ultimately it's about asking questions and making decisions. And does this work, or is this successful? And when you cast directly in the ground, you can never fully control the final outcome. I never knew how a particular plant would cast, how it would translate, or what imprint it would leave. But I was always surprised at the level of detail that such a rough process could pick up. So you see like the veins in the leaves and the roots and the seed heads and the delicate thread and even the weave of the cloth. And it's that kind of unpredictable surprise that allowed me to cast 150 completely unique kind of sculptures.
And I'd like to ask you about natural elements, I guess, or natural spaces, because something that both Jodie and I share is we both grew up in rural East Sussex, and so nature was very much present kind of in our childhoods. But I'm curious about, for you as someone in your early experiences developing your artist practice, was nature important to you? Were there certain experiences that fed into your developing practice?
To be honest, I'd never really thought about that until you raised the question. I did grow up in rural East Sussex, but I don't know if it led me here where I am today. I've been making work for 20 years, and basically each work has informed the next, so it's been this kind of natural progression in the studio. I think like my early years were very formative. I think they made me who I am. Sadly, my dad died a few weeks before I was born, so it was always just Mum and I, and she was a cleaner, so she used to take me to work with her a lot, like all through the school holidays, and she'd set me up in the corner of someone's conservatory or hallway, and then I would just sit and draw and make while she was working. And she worked for a lot of elderly people, so I saw a lot of fragility and vulnerability from a very early age. And also saw into people's lives. As a cleaner, you kind of see, you're welcomed into people's homes. And I had one lady who would love to give me a tour of her flat on the seafront every week, and she would take me round all the objects, every single object in her home, and tell me where it had come from, who gave it to her, and the significance behind all her things. And I just remember being really deeply affected at a very young age at how like these small, say, ceramic objects could hold such significance and histories to them.
Yeah, I guess in that thread as well, objects and things that are meaningful, flowers are a really significant part of your work, in this work here, but also previous pieces that you've made. And you told me before about the work that you made from, is it handcrafted flower arrangements with newspaper, and you stained them, and we thought we've got some images here because thought it could be quite interesting to maybe look back in a way and sort of trace the trajectory of how flowers have had different iterations or manifestations through your work over time.
Yeah, I only really recently made the connection between past and present. I didn't really join the dots, but flowers have been part of my practice since the very beginning. This was my degree show. This was my degree show, and I made a number of them. They were very large floral arrangements which were handcrafted from newspaper that had been stained with blood, tea and coffee. It was entitled The Daily Mail. I don't know how to make it work. Does anyone?
The little down arrow, I think you can.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then this was my show at the New Art Gallery, Warsaw. I managed to extract dyes from a bouquet of flower, which I used to colour thread, and then I crocheted it into a 7-metre piece. I actually had a textile background, so I studied textiles at Goldsmiths before I started at Fine Art. And there was quite a hierarchy between textiles and fine art in that day, and it took me a long time to be confident enough to use textiles in my, I don't know how to work this, to someone, to use, oh here we are, thank you, to use textiles in my practice. But this show at Warsaw, in one of the rooms I had these huge plaster sculptures that were like 300 kilograms each and took 5 techs to move around, and then this was I carried up in a handy bag on the day of install, and it just was able to hold and occupy space in exactly the same way as these huge, as the heavy plasterworks, and that was quite eye-opening for me. But yeah, I also found these glass plate negatives from the 1920s. I didn't actually know what was on them when I bought them online, and when I developed them, just by chance, they were these wilting floral arrangements, very much in the Vanitas tradition. And when I developed them, I chose not to clean them up in any way, so that blue patch is where the cardboard had stuck to the glass plate negative. So the images showed all the history, all their history, and it was just interesting that someone, however many years ago, was exploring the same themes I was. And this was a show in Berlin, again another weaving project where I took the dyes made from flowers and coloured the thread, and then hand wove lengths of cloth, and it was a very sort of subtle change of colour. So they went from white, and then they followed the architectural, the space of the architecture.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well to see this installation in terms of how you use space, because I guess it really takes us to how you've conceived the gallery and this installation as being a really important part of the work God. Maybe next, could you talk us through how you actually conceived this installation, the kind of environment or experience that you wanted to create for visitors?
Well, the idea began after COVID. I had my daughter shortly before the pandemic came. And when I had my son, I never actually took any time off. I carried on working through, which is what I intended to do with my daughter. But then the pandemic came and it kind of enforced this break. And then suddenly I had two very small children, non-sleeping children, and it was all-encompassing, and I really struggled to come back to the studio, and I struggled to find a way to come back to a life where I made work 7 days a week. And when I did come back to the studio, and I just sat down and so tired, and I just looked around at the devastation, and all in the months away, all these weeds had grown up, and they'd come through. I have a very barren, concreted space outside of it. They'd come in through the concrete, through the gaps in the fence and through the gaps in the door, and they were really tall. And I just was so so interested in the resilience and strength of these plants, and that's really where the project kind of began. And then obviously once you see something, you just start seeing weeds everywhere, so like along roadsides and derelict buildings. And I just started to think about what it was that made something a weed as opposed to a plant, and I realised it was all about perception, and because what we consider a weed changes over time. So plants now that we consider a weed, we actually used to grow for medicinal purposes, or we even imported plants that we now consider a weed. So I wanted to include as many plants, so my brief kind of widened, and I wanted to include as many plants as possible. And I started thinking about how different plants have different meanings for different people.
And also just the sheer number of works in the gallery to create this forest that you walk through. It's very striking as an encounter, and as you were saying before, it speaks to the labour, the physical labour, the temporal labour of being involved in that process, and what that process actually requires of you. And so, is that labour involved, and the sort of research that you touched upon, is that all part and very important to you, as a maker?
Well, the numbers were really important to me. I really wanted there to be this kind of weight and presence to the installation, just how I noted the strength and resilience of the weeds that were growing in Deptford. The project was incredibly demanding. The earth was very heavy and wet, and so moving it around was every day it was really physical. And yet the end works are really light and white, and it kind of in almost a complete contradiction to the darkness of the process. But I really wanted to cast through all the seasons to get this variety of plants, and so it was really arduous, like casting through the winter when the temperatures were freezing. I mean, I think even like the earth froze, and we would have to pour boiling water on it just to kind of loosen it up, and having your hands in ice cold water. But during the winter months, when the plant life was scarce, I had to rely more on the cloth and the thread.
And this also connects, I guess, to the title of the exhibition, which would be good maybe to speak about God, because it speaks to the positioning of the works in space. They're these static, centaur-like structures that are almost watching over the space in a way. And I think guard is quite an interesting word, because it has this sense of keeping watch over something, to control, to prevent harm, but also on a deeper level, it suggests protection of making sure that something doesn't get lost or doesn't get erased. There's kind of nuances there in terms of how that word functions, and I'm curious to know how you came up with this title in the first place.
Well, the title was born at the very beginning of the project. For me, the word guard wasn't about control, it was about taking care and protecting and looking after. I really like evocative titles that are open to interpretation. I find titles really difficult, and I've been making, at the beginning, a lot of my work was untitled, but when you've been making work for like 20 years, that causes problems. So often a work can grow a name in the studio whilst we're making it, and then I think it's only right that the work, the name carries through into exhibition.
Yeah, for sure. And I think something you said before, that your works are not really about the image, it's really about that direct relationship between the work and the viewer. And so something else that we notice when we encounter these works is their very human scale and sense of presence. And so whether that's your own body as the artist who made them, or the viewers of those who are encountering them in the space. And so what role does that relationship to scale play in the works?
I always make my work in response to the site in which it will be shown, like ceiling height, natural light, architectural features. They all play a part in how a viewer will view and encounter your work. And when I saw the new gallery space, I immediately saw this wonderful sight line that went all the way through all the different spaces. And so I knew I wanted to make a work that travelled all the way through. And in this way, the work is kind of boundless. So you can kind of imagine bigger spaces or more rooms and more works. And in this way, the installation isn't about a specific number, it's more about a concept. But the scale was considered. I didn't want them to tower above you. I wanted them to have a relationship to the human body, and for people to be able to walk through and experience the work. The monumentality comes from the collective rather than the individual, and so it was very important that the works weren't the same, that they were all individual and unique.
Yeah. And going back to flowers, this body of work obviously addresses that particular relationship that humans have to flowers, how they serve as vessels or vehicles for mark making, for different acts of commemoration, celebrating things like cultural identity, and but also they have can be used in terms of conflict and death, and so they have this very nuanced layers of interpretation. So I'm curious to know about your own research and interest in our relationship to flowers and how that relates to the works upstairs.
We give flowers to others as like a mark of respect or love or thanks, and we often think of their vitality and vibrance as a gesture of life and beauty, but ironically the cut flowers are already dying, so you could see, and so they could be seen as more as a symbol of our own mortality, and which is kind of deeply rooted in the history of art. But the relationship between flowers and people is special. We tend plants much like we tend a loved one, and we infill plants with meanings for many different reasons. So it might remind us of someone we love or a time in our life. Flowers are often linked to cultural identity, so quickly become synonymous with atrocity and conflict around the world. So most recently we had the sunflower became a recognisable symbol of support for Ukraine. But flowers have always grown amongst the devastation of war. Poppies, carnations, forget-me-nots, they all are historically bound to war and remembrance. So we tend to think of these plants beyond their seasons. Therefore, it seemed important to me that we used as many different plants as possible. I didn't buy any flowers or plants for the installation, but I collected weeds along roadsides and along the creek. And then my mum would bring up foliage from her garden and from the garden she worked in every week. I had a couple of bouquets gifted to me for Mother's Day and birthdays, and they too made it into the exhibition.
Something we've spoken about as well, I think in our first studio visit, was about the persistence of flowers, or the persistence of nature, really, in spite of our human tendency to actually destroy our natural environments. And I think that it connects to what you said before a lot about the importance of life cycles and the continuation of nature, kind of in spite of the actions that we might, do to the environment or way around us, and this kind of, they're larger than our fragile existence. yeah, how do you understand this balance between human and nature that is kind of seems to be very much in tension in your work?
I think when I was younger, I used to live very much in the here and now. I lived in the present, but I think as I get older, I'm, more thankful for every passing year. But technology has allowed us to understand so much more about the world in which we live, but also the kind of irreparable damage that, we are doing. The natural world is kind of fundamental to our survival, yet, on the most basic level, plants put oxygen into the atmosphere that we need to breathe, yet we continue to push deforestation and urban growth so that we're pushing systems to natural systems to the point of collapse. No other time, I don't think, has the in the history of humanity have we had to kind of grapple with the fate of the planet, but that responsibility falls to us.
And is this something that you feel that you're addressing in terms of the fragility of human life? Because, I think part of the problem is that humans have always sought to separate themselves from nature. There's always this human nature binary, when in fact we are and always have been part of nature. So, yeah, is that something that you're interested in terms of that fragility and how we might go back to, another space or that is more in tune with nature?
I think for a long time we've considered humans very separate from nature, and I think this kind of separation has led to a lack of care and compassion for all living things. And I think we've always kind of seen the natural ecological world as something to dominate or profit from. But this idea that humanity is in control of nature is a false perception. And I think we're starting to see how the fate of humanity is so intertwined with the fate of nature. Humans across all time periods have relied on plants for shelter and medicine and food. Yeah,
for sure. I think something that I also think about with your work is the relationship to time. It's something that we've spoken about, and it goes back to life cycles, but I think when we look at the sculptures upstairs, we simultaneously see them as being almost frozen in time. They're given an eternal life in their new form with jesmonite and the way you've shaped them. But these cast forms also speak to something that's lost in a way, something that was living and is now isn't. And how do you connect to this idea of time in your work, this idea of deep time, or the kind of different ways that time can be experienced through object making?
So the original plant sculptures only exist for a few hours, but then they are forever memorialised in the cast. There is a certain sadness to what has been lost, but it's kind of juxtaposed with kind of the monumentality of preserving these plants that may have only really existed for a few days or months and weeks, and they are forever memorialised. By casting directly in the soil, you engage with centuries of soil and concepts of entropy and time. Geological time, deep time, is almost impossible to comprehend, but I love how in geology you can almost see the time is written in the rock, so the level in the stratas is where the different time periods are. There's almost like an archaeological aspect to excavating the works, and I like to think of them as unearthed sculptures, like they're memorials of their own making, which kind of quietly avow to memory, but more as a contemplative process of their own retrieval rather than an echo of simply what has passed. So they're a bit like archaeological objects that are once buried that have now been found. I think we tend to relate archaeology with finding temples and palaces and tombs, but actually the discovery of really fragile plant remains has been equally important for learning about history in our past. And there's been examples of how seeds have lain dormant, and then during archaeological digs these ancient varieties of plant have bloomed because, and that these seeds have just laid dormant for up to 2,000 years. So it's like it literally is the living past.
Yeah, it's that amazing kind of persistence over time in spite of the brevity of human life. And I think, you know, a lot of your work is really addressing that fruitlessness of human endeavour. You know, throughout our lives we're always trying to make impressions on our surroundings, to make a mark, to protect, to resist the inevitability of that time will pass. And you know, we see all of these different rituals and commemorative acts that you spoke about in terms of how we actually try and carve out time in what would otherwise be a sort of very chaotic reality. And I think that, you know, your work really captures that, the beauty of that and the pathos of that, you know, and I think that that is very much resonant in the work. And yeah, it's something that you seem to be exploring as a tension, which is interesting.
I think very early on in my career I was really interested in the idea of the public memorial, and how, like, for these monuments, for all their grandeur and size and permanence and placement, never really captured how you felt when you lost someone. So instead I chose to work with fragile, ephemeral materials that may rot and decay over time, because life is both sad and beautiful. We all have our own rituals, like from our morning cup of coffee to how we say goodnight, and I think they help us to navigate and make sense of the world. And they ground us in a reality. I think it's these small moments that make us feel human, and they also allow us to relate to others and to connect and to feel empathy for others. And I think art is ultimately about communication and connection. I don't think it's about controlling meaning or dictating meaning, but really just the starting point for a wider conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Perhaps could be an interesting moment to open it out, actually, because I think be curious if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Jodie, but also any reflections on, you know, how you encounter those works and that installation upstairs and the sense that it creates in you. So yeah, please, if anyone would like to say or ask anything, please do. Yes.
Hi Jodie, thanks for a fantastic talk. Really intriguing insight. But what I realised looking at them live, which I hadn't noticed either in the video or stills, was the fact that they had a flat side and a round side. That hadn't really come home to me. And obviously that's a result of the casting process that you use. But how do you see that? You know, and obviously you're happy with it being like that, and it's intriguing that you've got this two-faced aspect to it, the flat face and the face that says all the stuff about the planet. How do you see that kind of relationship between the two sides of these things?
Yeah, so obviously that's the result of how they are made. It is an open cast. I really like to evidence how something is made. I never try to hide. I think often with especially public monuments, it's all very highly polished and you don't actually see the process. And for me, you know, it was very important that the wires that I used to suspend the armature then became the wires that actually enabled the work to stand up. So for me, it's about showing how something is made and the materiality, really, of the objects.
Thank you very much to both of you. There was a time where women artists could actually only make or represent flowers and plants and maybe insects. Do you think it's almost like not a revenge, but something liberating about suddenly monumentalizing these plants and flowers and, common flowers and weeds? Do you think there's something to that to your practice, or doesn't really?
No, I think so, because I studied textiles before, and it was a very feminist course, and it was drilled into us, you know, this hierarchy between fine art and textiles, and I hated it, absolutely hated it when I was during that college, but I've kind of come full circle now, and I appreciate it much more. I mean, before women could read, or, you know, could vote or read or pick up a pen, they used their needles and their threads to resist and to protest. Yeah, so it's very similar, really, the textiles and and it's kind of subverting the domesticity. Or like with some of my weavings, they were incredibly large, and they were actually very physical to make because I was dipping them in plaster and weaving on such a scale. So yeah, it's about kind of subverting that domesticity and yes, yeah.
Maybe this connects to the project that you're doing next, actually, because that was something else I wanted to ask you about. Because thinking about scale and working outdoors, which you've done before, but yeah, I'd be curious to know if you'd maybe say a little bit about the project that you're working on next.
I'm working on a project for the Artist's Garden, which is an outdoor space on top of Temple Underground, and it really is to allow women to make outdoor sculpture. And what's really exciting about it for me is that up until now, we've been kind of restricted with size and scale with the earth casting because we've always poured solid, but we've been really working on developing this process to be able to cast in the round by actually going so big you can climb in the mould yourself and then work from the inside using kind of a laminating technique with the jesmonite. So this way the objects are hollow, so you have lower material costs and you don't have the issues with transport and weight. So it allows you, it's really exciting as a process to be able to kind of scale it up, and also means that you could make it, obviously it's a concrete space on Temple, but at the Artist's Garden, but you know, you could take it anywhere to any kind of landscape and actually to make work in the landscape.
I was going to ask about the soil, the kind of soil you use is significant, and I was thinking the difference of it being significant just because it works well, but also where it's from and how are both those things important?
Well, I use soil from East Sussex because it's what I had access to, but also a friend at the studio did the very first time I earth cast. Just his wife was a landscape gardener, and they just very kindly just dropped off a ton of soil because I said I needed some. So I have worked with different soils. As I say, it all adds to that kind of unpredictability and chance because even if you were to cast the same object again and again, you would never ever get the same object out because how the weather, how wet the soil is, even chance all plays a part. But yeah, I mean, I'm not using a specific soil in such. It's just that it does happen. This one that I'm working with does happen to have quite a high clay content. Which makes it incredibly heavy all the time.
But it also comes from where you grew up.
Yeah, yeah. And also I had a museum show at the Foundling Museum a few years ago, and we actually took the studio to East Sussex to cast directly in the ground. That was really exciting, taking the work and actually making it in the landscape rather than in, say, the more concrete studio on the creek.
Any more questions?
I think probably a good moment to wrap up.
Yeah. Well,
thank you so much,
thank you, Becca.
Joseph and Jodie, and thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy weekend, so thank you all.